Right. Welcome to day 16. You can see my screen, right, guys?
Yes.
All right. Let's get started. Day 16 and a little recap from yesterday's class. We started looking at how components get rendered, and I introduced a small utility function that gets a random color each time a function is called. So this function is called and you get a random color. And I copied that random color. I called that random color on a background color of the each card. So every time a render function is triggered, so this is a render function. This is the entire thing is a render function. So we talked about how each time a render function is triggered, you get a random color. So that is like the component is taking another birth. Okay, and that's the component is going through another update. Now we talked about the regular component, the class-based regular component, and a regular component is nothing but which has all the component life cycles in it, and the component undergoes re-render only in two scenarios. Arjun, do you remember what are those two scenarios?
Sorry, I lost it.
Okay, a component only renders when two things happen. One is when a component internal state change happens, or if the component receives a new properties from externally. So this is the only two scenarios where the component is re-rendered. Now in our application we used a product card, and this product card we're reusing it. So each product card we're trying to generate a unique product card supplying unique piece of data every single time and reusing the same component over and again and again and again. On the code base we just have one single component product. The app.js is taking this product component and regenerating it, uh, however, depending on the number of items in this array. Now each product will have its own component lifecycle, will have its own props, own state, and all that stuff. Now when I click on the first component card, which is the first rendered of the product component, when I click on the first instance, it shouldn't affect the other instances because the other instances are not changing. Their properties are not changing. Only the first instance is changing. Or the first instance properties are changing. So React is not smart enough to understand which properties are changing. It just goes to the app.js. Since the set state happening in here, because we are setting a state every time the handling a new item to the cart. Now the app.js goes through another render cycle. When the render cycle is triggered, all the child components will also be triggered. So all the child components are the products will also be triggered. Even though they are getting the same piece of information every single time, they assume that they're getting a new piece of information and they start rendering. So we put in a logic in here using the should component update, a component lifecycle that we use, where if the properties change and only the properties that we care about change, the component undergoes a render. If the properties do not change or the properties change which do not need a render, then we return false. So this will avoid another render cycle. And this is an important interview question where how do you optimize React lifecycle? How do you optimize React renders? Or how do you optimize a component in React? Okay, so this is very important component lifecycle. It can really put a increase the performance of the application in exponential. And then we talked about how we can replace should component update with a pure component. One single adding a 4 characters to the pure component will able to rewrite the whole should component update, offboarding the load from the component to the internal React algorithm. So the internal React pure component will take care of that basically. So you don't have to do the extra stuff on the component itself. And then we went ahead and talked about a functional component. A functional component is nothing but it's just the React component, but without all the component life cycles. That's the only difference. A component life cycle without a class and without any component life cycles. And this is called a functional component. Now, when we try to do a functional component, we are getting back the same issue which we faced using a class-based component. So we use a React.memo, which is a functional components should component update. So functional component should behave as a pure component. So React.memo is nothing but a pure component version of functional component. Okay, there are 4 different components we talked about: class component, function, pure component, functional component, and functional memo component or memorization, or React memorizes its props. All right, folks. And then in today's session, we'll branch out and talk about the synthetic events. We already talked about one of the synthetic event. We'll talk about another synthetic event where right now we only talked about user clicking using the mouse. We'll go ahead and try to understand how user input can be saved on React world and can be retrieved back. Okay. Now for that, I'm creating another component, and let's try to add another product into our application. So if you have a random products in here, so my goal is to add another product into the database. Okay. So let's do that. I'm going in here all the way on the top, and let's create another component called add product. So this basically adds a product. It's nothing magical. Add product dot JS. Now what I would do in here, I would make the add component, add product as a default file as I refresh, and we will go down the line, and then we'll add a route. For the I'll go over that in another class. For now, what I would do is I'll go to app.index.js, and instead of app.js, by default, I would render an add product component, add product, and I would replace, I just have it in here, and replace add product in here, give it a refresh. Because my add component does not have any objects in here, I have to go create a component. Simple, import React from React. Every single time you're creating a component, this is must and should. Even though you're creating a functional component, you need to have the reference of React into that file, because end of the day, a functional component is also a React component. So reference of that React would only help you to create a React component in this file. Though I'm not using pure component, though I'm not using the React.component, I would still need React in my file. Okay, because it internally converts a functional component into an equivalent React component, more optimized React component. So let's go back to here, and I would just throw in let's go by creating a class component. And how do you decide if you need a class component versus a state component? How do you decide if you need a class component versus a functional component? This is a very often asked interview question. How do you decide if you need a functional component versus a class component? I'll try to write the component code in here. I'll walk you through the use cases where when I decided why would I need a class component. The moment I said we are trying to go add an item into the database, adding an item needs parameters like name, a category, price, and the image URL. So user have to type in or copy into a text box. Whenever a user is giving an input to the component, I would obviously need a state, and the state can be created only by using a class component. I'm not considering the React hooks right now. I keep telling that again and again. But now I need a state, and I would use a class component to create my state. So class, I would say add product extends. I could say React.component, or I can directly say component, and that would be auto imported here. And I'm using a VS Code, so it has an intelligence where you can try to do this, and it will auto import the packages. And do not depend on this intelligence. It sometimes breaks. It sometimes it doesn't work. So it's a good idea to always know how the syntax ahead of time. The component, and then inside the component, I render the the must and have component lifecycle in every React component, and I would just return, and I would just simply return a div this is add product. Okay, and what should I supposed to do now? I have to export it. So export default add product, and then give it a save. And on my screen, you should be able to see this is an add product. Okay, guys. Anything that I did for the last 10 minutes? Any questions on this?
Can you go over what's the purpose of doing?
Doing?
So we need to add some details of the product so that we are adding one more component. Is that the reason we did this?
Yeah, the reason we are trying to add another. So if you're in an e-commerce website, you have to put the data, right? As if you're on a store, you're trying to sell something, you have to put the details of that product onto a website.
Okay.
Okay, so what I would do is I would add a few inputs in here, and where you can try to enter the data, and then you can save the data onto your Firebase or the database. And then when you go, so you see I have a products in here. I have 29 products. So I would add another product, 30th product. And then when I refresh my page or go back to the product sheet, I should be able to see my 30th product as well. Okay, Vivek?
Yeah, got it.
Okay, I'm just adding another product. Okay, so I'm adding a product in here. I'm just adding a simple input tags. If you are familiar with HTML input tag, it's just another a regular HTML input, nothing fancy in there. Okay, so then I would go and say something like this. I would do, let's say, product name, and refresh the product name. Then I also need the product price. Okay, and then I also need the product image URL. I would also need the category, I think, right? Instead of product name or price, we are still dealing with it. I would just say name, price. And what else I have it here? Image URL, right? Okay, so
Is there any way that we are referring that these new products are stacking to the existing products?
can you come again?
How are we making sure that these new adding of products is been adding to existing products?
Yes, we will put in an URL there. So we were trying to get the data from that URL, right? We can also get the data from an API. We can also put the data on the API. Okay, so we'll use an API to put the data onto your. Okay, so that's a good question. So let's open up Postman. So until today, we were only able to get the data from a URL, right? So I copy this guy, I go to products, copy this, go to another products.json. Now I'm able to get the data, but how do I put the data? There's no way to put the data. I mean, I'm able to read from the database. I'm not able to write to the database, and the browser would not allow me to write to the database. You can go fancy and do it from the console, but there is a tool that really helps you to better write and read from the database, and that tool is nothing but Postman. This tool would actually help you to read your request, also helps you to intercept your request. We'll go in detail about the interceptor if time permits, but let's go ahead and create a request. Let's do this. Can I close them all? Close all tabs. Don't save. So I just say get in here and I put my URL .json and send. As soon as I send, you see how clear my I'm getting a JSON data from an API. And this is not possible on the browser. There are other plugins that you can have to put in on the browser plugin in order to make your JSON look like JSON. This is just a regular string. The browser does not know it's a JSON or a string, so it does not clearly show you it. We call that in the programming world called pretty. It doesn't show us pretty. You have to make it look pretty. It doesn't show raw, but you have to make it pretty. And Postman have a lot of functionalities, a lot of this little tiny tool buttons that makes to read and write to the database much easy. So I'm writing to the data, I'm reading from the database, and one method, if you are if you have remember, we used a get to get the data from a fetch call. So we'll go back in here and app.js on the component did mount. We used fetch. If you do not supply any method to a library or to a fetch library, it assumes that this is a get call. Now, how do I know it's a get call? Let's go to the browser. Let's go to the browser and inspect the get call again. So go back here. I'm going to my index.js, putting back my app here, and then give it a refresh and go to inspect and to the network tab right in here. I give it a refresh again and it's making a bunch of API calls. All of them are URLs for the images, but there's one call that is interested in. There's a little box in here that you can type in products because that is a products API. And then I click on it and go to headers. And you can see it's requesting a URL and the request method is get. So it's asking the database, I need the data. Okay, I'm getting the data, but there are other methods as well. Okay, and the most used methods are just three: get, put, and post. We'll talk about put and post now. Okay, so let's open up another URL, and I'm using the same URL. I'll put this to a side. Okay, and put it in here. I'm pushing the data from the left and my data should be visible on the right. Okay, as simple as that. So I'll get one of the products. I'll just grab one product. So this is one product in here. I'll grab this product, and what I do is I'll go back to Firebase. Take a look on the 30th line in here or the entire product in here. Let's go by doing a post first. Okay, so I would do, so these are all the list of methods or operations that you can make on an API. The most used ones are get, the second most used one is post, and depends on how your backend is set up, how your backend APIs talk. You also get to do put, and it really depends on a backend developer who is doing this API, on the backend decisions they take. Okay, so getting the records is get, posting the records is post, replacing the records is put, replace the record, and patch the record is you have piece of information. Like for example, in my case, let's go to post body, and I'm using a raw body, and this is my JSON. Okay, and category and all that stuff, category ID not. So I say some product, and I would say maybe because I'm using 29 in here, I would say 30, and let's see what happens. I'm using a post call in here, so I'm posting the data to the API and see what happens as soon as I hit send. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Look what happened. It created another record on the database. don't worry about this random key in here. That is done by the Facebook. Every time you make a post call, it actually creates a new node. So when I do a send button again, it does not replace the existing key. It actually creates a new record. And this is something to do with the Firebase database. Okay, and see what happens. The data that I sent from the Postman has been pushed to the database. Okay, if I go back and refresh my URL, I think that would obviously break because something is not right. So this is something to do with the Firebase sending an object. So this is all about posting the data. Okay, this is how you post the data to a database. Now you have something called put. Now what is the difference between a put and a post is that, now it depends on how your backend architecture is. People interchangeably use post and put. To me, it's always post is to add data. Okay, post is to add the data, put is to replace the data. What I mean by a replace the data is that, say I'm using products.json in here and I use a put method. The products.json should be entirely replaced by only this data in here. So what I do is I say send and see what happens on the Firebase. 3, 2, 1. The entire products array has been replaced with this piece of data here. This is the difference between a put and a post. What if I do a post? Let's see what happens. When you're posting the data, you're creating a new record. Okay, cool. Now let me reset the Firebase. I just created a UI that if anything goes wrong, I can able to go reset my Firebase. So what happens? You see what happens if I reset my Firebase. This is the application web that we're gonna go create it, and that will reset my data back again. And now let's go and enough of Firebase. Let's go back to our React world and try to understand what we can do with add product and init. So I'm gonna add a little styling here and there to make it little pretty. Okay, so let's go back to our index.js and replace the add product here. And this is how the add product is. And I have all the styles. They already did it. So let's go and add those styles in here. So I have a top class, which is add form __ form. So I'm using a beam block element modifier naming convention in here. You know what? Let's just I'm just making it look a little pretty so we can work along. So I added all those class names, and I just added a little more room between the input and output. And also I'm gonna add, so I just added the class names. I haven't added the style sheet yet. So I would go here, create a new file under the styles folder, And what I would do is, you guys know about this. Instead of using a capital case, I use a lower case. And instead of using a camel case, I would use a hyphen. Okay, add hyphen product, because I really want to separate what is a React component, what versus what is that style sheet. And this really helps me to understand the separation clearly. So this is a CSS. I already have the styles written for this component. I would just gonna go and copy paste this. Nothing fancy, simple CSS. Okay. And I'm gonna go back to my add product and import that file in here. Did I say .css? Okay, so I just made it look little pretty. That's all. Now let's go back to our input add product component, and I start typing it and see what happens. And you can see as I'm typing it, it takes my input. The add button really doesn't do anything as of now right now, because I do not have any event handlers to that add button. Okay, so as I'm typing it, now you guys tell me, where is the data that is saving? As I'm typing it, I'm not saving that data into any variable on the React world. I'll put in a little separation in here for you guys to focus on one single input. Okay, so let's focus on one single input in here, and the rest of the things we'll do the same thing. So let's focus on one single input in here. I'll also give it a little differentiation between this guy. Okay, so where do you think for this input right in here, I'm trying to add the data, where do you think that the value is going to? Do I have a variable, or who stores this value? Let's see what happens as I type in. Okay, so you see this value has to be stored somewhere, right folks? This value has to be stored somewhere. Somebody is trying to capture. If I type A, somebody is storing A, and if I type B, somebody is storing A and the B and replacing A with A and B, right? So there's some place that this value has to be stored, and that is stored on the DOM, on the browser. Okay, and React has no control over this value. When React does not have a control over this value, then this becomes an uncontrolled component. There are two types of inputs in React world, two types of inputs, controlled and uncontrolled. I will talk about controlled component, but for now, this is called uncontrolled input. An uncontrolled input is not controlled by the React because there's no variable on the React that controls this value. I cannot set a value on this input on a controlled on the controlled input, right? The browser, the DOM manages the value, and the DOM, React are two separate things. React only manipulates the DOM. It's only one way. The DOM changes are not reflected, are crawled back into the React until you have some laziness. Right now, the browser is saving the value, and that is called an uncontrolled component. But I can make this component controlled component by forcing the input to have a value by simply saying a input, I'll take an attribute called value. So input takes an attribute called value is equal to, I can say some value and give it a save and see what happens. This is some value has been a default value of that component. Now, is this a controlled component or an uncontrolled component?
Controlled maybe.
Yes, exactly. This is a controlled component because when I type something, I cannot type on the input because React has the control over this component. Whatever the value, whatever goes into this input of this value will stay forever on this input. You cannot go, I cannot really type into this component, and this is controlled component. React is controlling the value of this component. I keep saying component. React is trying to control the value of this input. Okay. Now, if the React is controlling the value of this input, I cannot type, and that the form is useless. I have to type the data into this form, right? And I have to get back the value from this form. And that is the reason we have, in a very similar fashion, we have on click for an input, you have on change. Okay. For anything to do with a mouse, you have an on click, you're clicking. But anything to do with an input, you're changing the value inside an input, right, folks? You're changing a value, and that is called on change. And this on change value is called every single time user makes a keystroke, every single time. And let's go and do a very simple console login here and see what the user is trying to do. So what I do is equal to, then I call a function, and my function name, this is user input. So what should I name this function as? What is the normal convention of naming the function, the prefix of that function? Arjun, you remember the prefix? What is the prefix that we use for a function that is being triggered by the user input? Go to the app.js and see what happens on the on click, the product, and see what did we name. What did we name that function? Prefix? Handle.
Handle. Okay.
Right. So we always name the functions that are generated by the user handle, because we are handling the input. We are handling the user input. And I say handle on change, or handle name change, or handle name input. Whichever function name makes more sense to the current context, just give that. Okay. So I would say handle name change. Okay. And since I do not have this function in here, I would go back in here and I would create that function. And then I would simply say console.log and user just type. Okay. And I refresh it and inspect and go back to our console window and see what happens as soon as I type in. User just type. If you see a number 2 in here, that means that it's been consoled 2 times. So I typed it in 2 times now, and I'm typing it again. So every single time user makes a keystroke, that function is called, right? And now I need the value from this input, right? Whatever the user is typing. Now, right now, I should get some value. In the first place, I should get some value, right? How do I get that some value into my handler function? Now, that is where a synthetic event comes into the play again. Now, this handle name change function is called with a keyboard event. Okay, so this is an event. And let's console log that event and see what is inside that event. Inspect again. And console and hit it back again. And now you should see synthetic event. That is a synthetic event. And inside the synthetic event, you have a lot of information about every single thing that the user have did on the keyboard. I'm just using simple keystroke, but if you go closer into it, it has a lot of information about what is the keystroke, what is the type, what is the target, and all that stuff. It's all null in now, because the target. This is a synthetic event. It wraps on the native event. This is the native event of the browser. Every browser will have its own event. Now React should handle every browser event, right? So what React does is it has a wrapper on top of the native event, which is called a synthetic event. and there's a lot of information in here. You can get the timestamp of when did the user click on it and all that stuff, right? But I'm interested in not just this stuff. I'm interested in the value that is inside the input. So what I do in here is, instead of event, I would say event dot target. If you see this event dot target is null in here, but it's not null internally. It's just null because of the native event. But how about that synthetic event? The synthetic event can be accessed using event dot target, and see what happens when I click on the value again. It's giving me the input target. Now guys, target is a very usual term in a web world. A target is nothing but an HTML element that is generating this event. In our case, what is the target? This guy, the input is the target. That guy is generating an event, right folks? That guy is generating an event. And if I hover it, the event dot target is nothing but this value. And what I need from this guy, if you take a closer look at this component, how can I extract the value from this guy? I have a target and I need a value from the target. And this is an object. I know this is an HTML tag, but internally it's still an object. So think, how do I get a value from a target if it's an object? As simple as target.value. That's all. And I click on something and it should get me the value, right? Is there something fishy in here? The text input is some value and I typed C on my keyboard, and the event, the handle change event is called with some value and the C next to it. Okay, and I would type Z on my keyboard and see some value and Z. So it's getting the existing value plus the new event that the user have put in, right? You with me, guys?
Yeah.
Vivek,
I'm following. I got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
are you with me?
Yes.
So I need to get the value from here and then pass it to the value in here. So as a user types in, I need to update a variable and then call the render function to reflect the variable, reflect the value of that variable. So what do I need in here? What is an object that I need in here that makes that every time I do a change on that object should call a render function? What concept should I put in here that every time a render function should be called on every keystroke? When does
And
when does a component undergoes a render?
One more time, bro. What's the question?
When do a component undergoes a render? When does a render function is called on a component?
When does
the
the
state
render
changes.
When the state changes on the second time? And what is the second type? What is the second scenario when the render is called?
in the
You
component life cycle?
when an event user changes, user actions.
Okay, let me repeat that again. A component render is called only in two scenarios. First is an internal state change using a set state, or the component receives a new set of properties. Okay, you know, digest this fact, and because this is all about React. The props and the state is all. These are the only two concepts that makes React possible. a component renders, a component refreshes, or a component is on updates on the UI only in two different scenarios. If you do a set state internally, or if the component receives a properties externally. Okay, make that very clear. Now in this case, I need a component to re-render again. So what is that I have to use in here? Should I use a prop or a state?
State.
State. So what I would do is, anytime a user clicks on the keyboard, I would update my state. So I would do something like this. I would create my first empty state constructor super, and then I would call my state. Inside my state, I have a variable called name, and initially it is empty in here, and I would pass the same state value to the input because that is the initial value, which is empty in this case. So how do I listen to a variable in a state to the input?
Set state.
How do I listen to a state variable? How do I get the access to that state variable inside my view? Exactly. So I will have to use this dot state dot name here, and then I give it a refresh. And as soon as as soon as a user clicking on something, you should see that I should update my state now. So as a user starts clicking on the keyboard, I have to update my state. So what I do in every time a handle name change is called, I would set the state. This dot set state, and I update the name using event dot value dot target, and see what happens. As a user types in, you can see that cannot read the property set step on define. Now you guys tell me, how do I fix this?
You have to call that set state in constructor.
Call a set state in a constructor. Interesting. You create a state in the constructor and then call a set state in the constructor. You mean binding it?
But bind, yeah,
Right.
something.
So bind it. This dot handle name change is equal to this dot handle name change dot bind. And now as user types in, it should update. And every single time, look at the subsequent update. So I'll call in the, I'll type in the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and see what happens. When I first type in 1, and we'll look at the state, how the state is changing as well. Add product, and this is the state inside the name. See how the state is changing. I click on 1, state is changed to 1. I click on 2, the state is changed to 1 and 2. Because 1, 2. Because the first event is 1, the second event is 1, 2. Go back to console state. The first event is 1, the second event is both 1 combined with 2, and the third event is 1, 2, 3. So anytime a set state happens, the function is called, it takes the current value and also takes the user input and puts them together. Okay, and that is how a state is, that is how you make an uncontrolled component to a controlled component. Any questions on this so far? I'm done for today. Let me know if you have any questions.